In the bitter winter of 1804, a grand estate on the outskirts of Westfield, Massachusetts harbored secrets that would not remain buried beneath the snow. From the road, the Harlowe mansion's glowing windows promised salvation to travelers caught in New England's merciless storms. Inside, Josiah and Abigail Harlowe served elaborate feasts on fine china to distinguished guests. By morning, those same plates would be empty, and their guests never seen again. When authorities finally breached the mansion's elegant facade, they discovered something no medical textbook could explain. 17 living victims in underground chambers, surgically altered beyond recognition. Some were missing portions of brain, others had organs replaced with mechanical contraptions of Josiah's design. All had been dinner guests who made the fatal mistake of accepting the Harlowes' renowned hospitality. Before we continue with the chilling story of the Harlowe household and their house of scientific horrors, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and hit that notification bell to never miss our explorations of America's darkest historical secrets. And let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. These buried truths lurk in every corner of our nation's history, perhaps even in your own backyard. The Massachusetts of 1804 stood at a crossroads between colonial past and industrial future. The Revolution's dust had barely settled, while the economic foundations of the new republic were still being laid by merchant families like the Harlowes. Winter transformed New England into an isolating expanse of snow-covered forests and treacherous mountain passes, where travelers relied on the kindness of strangers for survival. Westfield had established itself as a modest but prosperous town, situated advantageously along trade routes connecting Boston to Albany. Its 2,000 residents maintained a traditional Puritan work ethic, even as the strict religious fervor of earlier generations softened into more genteel Episcopal and congregational observances. The townspeople operated tanneries, small textile operations, and farms that lay dormant under winter's heavy blanket. 5 miles beyond Westfield's town centre, along the old Albany Post Road, stood the Harlowe Estate, an architectural anomaly that spoke to wealth beyond local standards. The 3-story federal-style mansion featured imported glass windows, a columned portico, and gardens that, even in winter, showed evidence of European design sensibilities. The house stood as a monument to the fortune Josiah Harlowe had accumulated through his textile innovations and shrewd investments. The Harlowe place wasn't just a house, recalled Eleanor Simmons, whose grandmother had served as a housemaid in Westfield during that era. The way folks described it, it was like a piece of Boston aristocracy dropped into our rural wilderness, something that didn't quite belong, but commanded respect nonetheless. Josiah and Abigail Harlowe had arrived in Westfield in 1798, already wealthy and childless. Josiah, then 45, presented himself as a retired medical researcher from Harvard who sought the countryside's peace for his continuing studies. His wife, Abigail, 15 years his junior, quickly established herself in local society through charitable works and impeccable manners. Together they cultivated an image of sophisticated benevolence that was impossible to question. "My great-grandfather served on the town council with Mr. Harlowe," said Jonathan Pierce, a Westfield Historical Society member whose family records provided crucial insights. In his private letters, he described Josiah as a gentleman of extraordinary education whose intellectual pursuits occasionally render him distant, though never discourteous. He noted that while Josiah rarely smiled, his generosity with both knowledge and fortune made him an asset to our developing community. Josiah soon accepted the position of town magistrate, where his Harvard education and rational temperament made him an authority in resolving disputes. Abigail, meanwhile, organized charitable efforts through St. John's Episcopal Church, ensuring that widows and orphans received care during harsh winters. Their social position became unassailable, a crucial element in what would later unfold. Most notable among the Harlowe's social contributions were their seasonal dinner parties. 3 times yearly at midwinter, spring equinox, and harvest, they opened their mansion to both local dignitaries and travelers of distinction. These events became legendary for their lavish menus, intellectual conversations, and the Harlowes' uncanny ability to anticipate their guests' every comfort. The invitations were delivered on cream parchment sealed with blue wax, noted a preserved letter from Catherine Worthington to her sister in Boston. To receive one was to be acknowledged as a person of consequence in Westfield. Abigail personally wrote each invitation in a perfect hand, addressing specific interests of the recipient. Mine mentioned my fondness for astronomical discussions, which I'd mentioned only once in her presence, months earlier. The Harlowes' Midwinter Feast of January 1804 would host 22 guests, an ambitious number given the season's travel difficulties. The invitation list included merchants from Albany, a judge from Springfield, 3 physicians, including newly arrived Dr. Benjamin Whiting, the Episcopal minister, and various local officials with their wives. The snow began falling 3 days before the event, but remarkably, every invited guest arrived. What travellers and townsfolk alike failed to notice was the pattern that had developed over the previous 5 years. Parish records maintained by Reverend Thomas Payne of St. John's Episcopal Church documented at least 17 instances of visitors who had reportedly stayed at the Harlowe estate but were never seen departing. Westfield. The register shows that Reverend Payne maintained meticulous records of visitors to our small community, explained Dr. Margaret Holloway, who researched the case extensively for the Massachusetts Historical Society. His notes include Frederick Chambers, a clockmaker from New York who dined with the Harlowes in February 1799 and allegedly continued to Boston the following day. Inquiries from his family 6 months later revealed he never reached his destination. Similar notations exist for 16 others, merchants, academics, a French language instructor, 2 physicians, and several persons of independent wealth. When questioned about these disappearances, the Harlowes provided plausible explanations. Some guests had supposedly continued their journeys by different routes. Others had accepted positions elsewhere based on connections made during their stay. A few reportedly continued to the Harlowes' summer property in Rhode Island. With Josiah's position as magistrate and the couple's impeccable standing, such explanations were accepted without investigation. Dr. Benjamin Whiting had arrived in Westfield only 2 months before that fateful January dinner party. At 32, he had established a respected medical practice in Hartford, but sought the opportunity to be the primary physician in a smaller community. Educated at Yale and having completed additional studies in Philadelphia, Whiting represented modern medical thinking that was beginning to move beyond humoral theory toward more scientific approaches. Whiting's medical journals from December 1803 show he was already taking careful note of unusual patterns of illness in Westfield, explained Dr. Holloway. He documented 3 cases of memory disturbances and partial paralysis that defied conventional diagnosis. Unknown to him, these patients had all previously served as household staff at the Harlowe estate and been dismissed for inefficiency. His scientific curiosity about these cases likely saved his life. The dinner invitation from the Harlowes arrived at Whiting's door on January 12, 1804. Though flattered by the social recognition, his acceptance was primarily motivated by professional networking. The opportunity to meet the retired Harvard medical researcher who had preceded him in the community. Nothing in his background prepared him for what he would discover beyond the Harlowes' elegant facade. Snow fell steadily on the evening of January 15, 1804, as carriages delivered guests to the Harlowe mansion. Footmen in formal livery assisted visitors up the marble steps, where Abigail greeted each arrival with remarkable personalization. The entrance hall gleamed with polished wood and crystal chandeliers imported from France. A massive hearth burned apple wood, filling the space with sweet warmth that contrasted sharply with the bitter cold outside. Mrs. Harlowe knew precisely which topics would interest each guest doctor, Whiting later wrote in his personal account. She mentioned my recent paper on tuberculosis treatments, though I had published it only in a limited circulation medical journal. Her knowledge of her guests' activities bordered on uncanny, as if she had conducted research on each of us. The dining room featured a table that could accommodate 30, set with fine china bearing the Harlowe family crest. Servants moved with practiced efficiency, seemingly anticipating needs before they were expressed. Dr. Whiting noted that these staff members exhibited unusual characteristics. They never spoke, moved with mechanical precision, and kept their faces partially hidden beneath high collars and caps pulled low. The meal progressed through 7 courses, wrote Whiting, each more elaborate than the last. Josiah presided at the head of the table, engaging guests in discussions of politics, science, and philosophy. I observed that he skillfully extracted information about each person's background, assets, and connections without revealing much about himself. Most notably, he kept a leather-bound ledger beside his plate, in which he occasionally made notations when he believed no one was watching. As the evening progressed, Whiting noticed Abigail's insistence that guests consume everything served. When Judge Harrington from Springfield left a portion of his game hen untouched, she personally encouraged him to finish, claiming the recipe contained special nutrients to fortify against winter ailments. Throughout the meal, a distinctive herbal aroma permeated every dish, subtle but persistent enough that Whiting, with his medical training, recognized the potential presence of medicinal ingredients. The most disturbing moment came during the 5th course, Whiting recorded. Samuel Pritchard, a wealthy merchant from Albany, complained of dizziness and asked to retire early. As a servant led him from the room, I observed the Harlowes exchange a glance of what I can only describe as satisfied expectation. Within the hour, 3 more guests requested assistance to their rooms, all exhibiting similar symptoms of disorientation and fatigue. By the final course, an elaborate dessert of custards and brandied fruits, half the dinner party had retired. Whiting observed that the remaining guests were primarily local officials and their wives, who had consumed less of the later courses due to ongoing conversations. While pretending to enjoy his dessert, Whiting secretly disposed of portions in his napkin, his medical instincts now fully aroused to potential danger. As midnight approached, only 5 guests remained in the parlour, wrote Whiting. Josiah suggested a tour of his library to show recent acquisitions from Europe. While the others followed him, I excused myself to check on my patient, Mr. Pritchard, claiming professional concern about his sudden illness. This deception gave Whiting the opportunity to explore the mansion's east wing, which Abigail had mentioned was closed for renovations. Instead of seeking Pritchard's guest room, Whiting moved silently through the darkened hallways, noting that numerous doors were locked, unusual for a home hosting overnight guests. The library occupied the mansion's northeast corner, a 2-story room lined with thousands of volumes. While Josiah led the remaining guests through discussions of rare editions, Whiting noted that one bookcase appeared different from the others. Its position against the wall seemed slightly askew, and the floor beneath it showed scuff marks suggesting movement. I returned after the other guests had retired, drawn by both suspicion and medical curiosity. Whiting documented. The mansion had fallen silent, except for the occasional creaking of old timbers, contracting in the cold. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 2 as I slipped back into the library, with only a small candle to guide me. What happened next would expose the truth behind the Harlowes' respected facade. Whiting discovered that applying pressure to certain books caused the bookcase to pivot, revealing a hidden staircase descending below the frost line. The steps led to an underground complex that extended well beyond the mansion's footprint, a series of chambers illuminated by oil lamps that never extinguished. The first room contained equipment I recognized from surgical theaters in Philadelphia and European medical illustrations, wrote Whiting. Bone saws of varying sizes, cranial drills, specialized retractors, and dozens of custom instruments whose purpose I could not immediately determine. All were arranged with meticulous precision on white linen cloths, polished to gleaming perfection. Beyond this preparation area lay the true horror, 3 interconnected chambers with walls of fitted stone that prevented any sound from reaching the world above. Each contained 4 bed-like tables equipped with restraints. Some held motionless figures covered with sheets, while others stood empty, recently cleaned. The air carried the unmistakable scents of chloroform, alcohol solutions, and human waste. Most disturbing was a separate study where Josiah apparently documented his work. A large desk held the same leather ledger Whiting had seen at dinner, now open to reveal elaborate diagrams of human anatomy with extensive notations. Beside it sat numerous journals dating back to 1787, their pages filled with detailed records of procedures and subject responses. The journals revealed a methodical madness that defied comprehension, Whiting recorded. Josiah Harlowe had indeed been a respected researcher at Harvard Medical School, but had been dismissed in 1797 for conducting unauthorized experiments on cadavers. His obsession involved discovering which portions of human anatomy could be removed or altered while maintaining minimum necessary function. The Westfield estate had been established specifically to continue this research using living subjects. The most recent journal entries detail the conditioning of dinner guests through carefully formulated combinations of belladonna, opium derivatives, and compounds Josiah had developed himself. The Harlowes' seasonal dinner parties served as selection events where the couple identified ideal subjects based on health, intellectual capacity, and lack of connections who might investigate their disappearance. I stood transfixed by the horror of this discovery, nearly missing the sound of footsteps on the stairs, wrote Whiting. Only my medical training, the instinct to maintain calm in crisis, prevented me from betraying my presence. I extinguished my candle and concealed myself behind a storage cabinet as Abigail Harlowe entered the chamber. She moved with the confidence of someone completely familiar with the space, checking on the covered figures and making notations in a separate ledger. When she departed 15 minutes later, Whiting remained hidden, his mind racing to process what he had uncovered and formulate a plan for escape. The journals revealed that the Harlowes maintained a rigorous schedule. Subjects selected from dinner parties were kept unconscious for 3 days using their specialized compounds. During this period, Josiah performed initial assessments to determine each victim's suitability for specific experimental procedures. Some were subjected to partial lobotomies to test theories about brain function. Others underwent removal of organs Josiah deemed non-essential, replaced with mechanical devices of his own design that he meticulously documented. Most disturbing were entries describing behavioral conditioning of survivors, chemical and surgical techniques that rendered victims docile and obedient while maintaining basic functionality. These successors became the silent servants who had moved so efficiently through the dinner party, their high collars and caps concealing surgical scars and partially removed features. Whiting's escape attempt was interrupted by a horrifying encounter. As he attempted to reach the hidden staircase, he found Abigail waiting in the library, a teacup in her steady hand and a pistol on the table beside her. "Dr. Whiting," she said with unnerving calm, "my husband expressed such interest in your medical knowledge during dinner. He will be delighted you've taken the initiative to explore his laboratory. He has questions about the functioning of the physician's mind that your participation will help answer." From the shadows emerged Josiah, accompanied by 3 servants, their vacant expressions and jerky movements now revealing their true nature as experimental subjects. The servants moved with unnatural coordination, responding to subtle hand signals from Josiah rather than verbal commands. "You've created quite a predicament for us," Josiah observed, his tone conversational, as if discussing a minor social faux pas. "We typically prefer to process our subjects while the compounds are still active in their systems. You have forced us to adjust our procedures." What followed was a scholarly exposition of Josiah's research that chilled Whiting more deeply than any threat could have. The former Harvard researcher explained his theories about human cognitive and physiological functions with the detached enthusiasm of a man discussing architectural plans or botanical specimens. "The human body is inefficiently designed," Josiah explained, showing no awareness of the moral abomination of his work. "So many redundant systems, so much wasted capacity. My research proves we need less than 60% of our original anatomy to maintain essential functions. The implications for medical science are revolutionary. Abigail's role in the enterprise became clearer as she detailed their selection methodology. Her social acumen identified ideal subjects, those with minimal family connections, transient professionals, or individuals whose disappearances would be attributed to the hazards of travel. Her specially developed compounds rendered victims compliant while preserving cognitive functions necessary for Josiah's experiments. "You should feel honoured, Doctor," Whiting, she explained with disturbing sincerity. "Most subjects contribute to only one aspect of Josiah's research. Your medical training makes you valuable for a longitudinal study. We can observe how a physician's mind responds to graduated procedures over months, perhaps years." Dr. Benjamin Whiting's survival and escape would later be described by the Springfield Gazette as a testament to extraordinary presence of mind amid circumstances of unimaginable horror. Recognizing that direct resistance against multiple opponents was futile, Whiting employed the only advantage available, his medical knowledge and the Harlowes' scientific curiosity. "I made a calculated decision to feign intellectual interest in their research," Whiting wrote. This approach played to Josiah's academic vanity while buying precious time. "I asked detailed questions about his methodology, theories, and documentation practices, expressing particular interest in the compounds they use for sedation." This strategy proved effective. Josiah, long isolated from genuine scientific discourse, eagerly expounded on his techniques. He produced formulation records for the compounds used at dinner, detailed enough that Whiting could identify key components and their effects. Most crucially, this discussion occurred in the main parlour, where refreshments were served by the altered servants. "I suggested that as a physician, I could provide more valuable feedback if I understood the full progression of their experimental protocols," Whiting explained. "This pretext allowed me to request a tour of the entire facility, including their compound preparation area. Throughout this process, I maintained a facade of professional curiosity that apparently convinced Josiah of my potential value as a collaborator rather than merely a subject." The opportunity for escape came when Josiah allowed Whiting to examine his pharmaceutical preparations. Familiar with the properties of the Harlowes' sedative compounds, Whiting managed to switch vials during a moment of distraction. When Abigail prepared evening tea, a ritual she maintained despite the circumstances, Whiting ensured that the Harlowes received cups containing their own sedative formula. "The compounds took effect gradually," Whiting recorded, "first affecting coordination, then speech, finally rendering them unconscious. I secured them using their own restraints, then faced the dilemma of the altered servants, who remained present but strangely passive without specific direction from their masters. The blizzard outside had intensified, with temperatures well below freezing and snowdrifts rendering roads nearly impassable. Nevertheless, Whiting determined that immediate escape offered the only chance of survival and intervention. Gathering essential evidence, including the most recent journal and ledger, he took a horse from the Harlowes stable and rode through the storm toward Westfield. "The journey of 5 miles nearly claimed my life," Whiting wrote. "Visibility extended barely beyond the horse's head, and the cold penetrated so deeply I lost sensation in my extremities within the first mile. Only the knowledge of what awaited should I fail drove me forward through conditions that would otherwise have been unsurvivable." Sheriff Caleb Holbrook was awakened at approximately 4:30 a.m. by pounding on the jailhouse door. He found Whiting nearly frozen, clutching a leather portfolio and barely coherent. The physician's wild tale of underground chambers and surgical horrors initially struck Holbrook as the ravings of a man suffering from exposure and possible frostbite. Holbrook's initial skepticism was entirely reasonable, noted historian Dr. Holloway. The Harlowes were pillars of the community, while Whiting was a newcomer babbling about secret passages and human experimentation. The sheriff might have dismissed the accusations entirely had Whiting not produced Josiah's journal, a document whose contents were too methodically detailed and technically accurate to be fabricated. Recognizing the potential gravity of the situation, Holbrook assembled a group of 8 men, including his deputies, and several respected townsmen, who could later attest to whatever they discovered. The storm had somewhat abated by mid-morning, allowing the group to reach the Harlowe estate by early afternoon. The official report describes a scene of eerie normalcy upon their arrival, explained Dr. Holloway. Servants admitted them, without resistance, moving with the strange mechanical efficiency that Whiting had described. The Harlowes themselves were nowhere to be found, having apparently regained consciousness and secured themselves elsewhere in the mansion, led by Whiting, who had insisted on accompanying them. Despite his physical condition, the search party located the hidden entrance to the underground chambers. What they discovered exceeded even the horror Whiting had described and permanently altered Westfield's history. Below the frost line, in chambers unknown to the world above, 13 living victims were found in various states of surgical alteration, read Sheriff Holbrook's official report. Some specimens, had portions of skull removed and replaced with glass or metal plates through which brain matter was visible. Others showed evidence of extensive abdominal surgery, with organs either removed or replaced by mechanical devices of unknown purpose. All victims exhibited surgical modifications to vocal cords, explaining their inability to call for help. The underground complex was far more extensive than Whiting had discovered during his limited exploration. Beyond the surgical chambers and recovery rooms lay living quarters where longer-term subjects were housed. These victims, some of whom had been missing for over 2 years, exhibited the most extensive modifications, surgical scars crossing their bodies like macabre road maps, missing limbs replaced with mechanical prosthetics, and evidence of repeated procedures performed over extended periods. Most disturbing were Josiah's complete records, spanning 15 years of systematic experimentation. The journals detailed over 70 subjects processed through the Harlowe estate. Each entry methodically documented which organs, tissues, and cognitive functions could be removed while maintaining minimum necessary life and obedience. The records revealed a progression from simple surgical alterations to increasingly complex procedures, combining surgery, chemical conditioning, and mechanical augmentation. Josiah's documentation revealed that his ultimate goal was to determine the minimum biological components necessary for human functionality, explained Dr. Holloway. He believed he could eventually reduce a human being to a brain, heart, and lungs, with all other functions replaced by mechanical systems of his design. More disturbing still, he viewed this not as mutilation but as improvement, liberating humanity from biological inefficiency. The Harlowes themselves were found in a hidden passage that connected to the stables, apparently attempting to escape. Josiah had been injured in the process, suffering a broken leg that prevented their departure. The couple offered no resistance when apprehended, maintaining the same calm, detached demeanor that had characterized their social presence for years. Josiah and Abigail Harlowe were taken into custody at approximately 4:15 p.m. on January 16, 1804, stated the official record. When informed of the charges against them, Josiah responded only that his research was being mischaracterized by the scientifically ignorant. Abigail requested that proper care be taken of her household, as she expected to return once this unfortunate misunderstanding was resolved. The subsequent investigation revealed connections and complicity that extended far beyond the Harlowe estate. Correspondence found in Josiah's study indicated that certain physicians from Boston and New York had been aware of his research, requesting specific anatomical specimens while maintaining plausible deniability about his methods. Financial records showed substantial payments from medical schools and private collectors for preparations that could only have been obtained through his experimental procedures. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting that several prominent Westfield citizens had suspected something amiss at the Harlowe estate but remained silent. Reverend Payne's records showed he had noted the pattern of disappearances but took no action, possibly influenced by Abigail's generous donations to the church. Similarly, merchants who supplied unusual quantities of medical equipment and chemicals had apparently chosen profit over investigating their customers' activities. The trial that should have followed never occurred. Official records indicate that both Josiah and Abigail Harlowe died in custody within 2 weeks of their arrest, supposedly from natural causes brought on by exposure. However, contemporary accounts suggest a different explanation. Letters between Sheriff Holbrook and the Springfield prosecutor suggest that vigilante justice was deliberately overlooked, noted Dr. Holloway. One communication states that certain parties whose family members suffered unimaginable violation visited the prisoners during a convenient absence of guards. No investigation into these deaths was pursued, and no charges were filed against any parties who might have been involved. The victims who survived presented unprecedented medical and ethical challenges. Some had been so extensively altered that complete recovery was impossible. Others had suffered brain modifications that left them permanently changed, capable of basic functions but missing essential elements of memory, personality, or emotion. The most severely affected remained institutional wards for the remainder of their lives, their true identities often impossible to determine due to Josiah's practice of removing identifying features and documentation. What's particularly disturbing from a historical perspective, explained Dr. Holloway, is how quickly official records were sanitized. Within months, the Harlowe case was documented as a simple murder investigation, in which an unspecified number of travelers had been killed. The full horror of the experimental program was deliberately obscured, possibly to protect the reputations of those who had been complicit through inaction. The Harlowe estate itself burned to its foundations in March 1805, officially attributed to lightning. However, multiple witness accounts suggest that townsfolk systematically destroyed the property, removing every trace of the horror it had contained. The underground chambers were supposedly filled with quicklime before being sealed and collapsed. For decades afterward, travellers reported strange phenomena along the old Albany Post Road where the estate had stood. Lights appeared beneath the ruins on winter nights, and sounds that might have been machinery or human moaning emerged from the ground during particularly cold weather. The forest path eventually fell into disuse, travellers preferring longer routes that avoided the site entirely. What remains most disturbing about the Harlowe case isn't just the methodical cruelty it revealed, but how effectively respectability and social position shielded monsters hiding in plain sight. Josiah and Abigail Harlowe's careful cultivation of unimpeachable reputations created an environment where questions went unasked and suspicions remained unvoiced. Their very hospitality, the elaborate dinners, the generous offers of accommodation, served as the perfect mechanism for selecting and acquiring victims. The case raises unsettling questions about similar operations that might have existed elsewhere. The Harlowe's correspondence with medical professionals in multiple cities suggests a network of individuals who, if not actively participating in such experimentation, were at least willing to benefit from its results. How many missing persons cases from the early 19th century might represent not wilderness accidents or commonplace murders, but something more systematically horrific? Perhaps most chilling is how the Harlowe's activities presaged later historical atrocities. Their methodical documentation, clinical detachment, and belief that scientific advancement justified any means eerily anticipated the medical experimentation of later centuries. Josiah's journals, with their precise measurements and observations, read like precursors to the records kept by physicians in Nazi concentration camps or Imperial Japan's Unit 731. What the Harlowe case ultimately teaches us is that horror often wears a respectable face. Behind their impeccable manners and charitable works, Josiah and Abigail Harlowe had constructed a literal underworld where human beings became raw material for experimentation. Their dining table, with its fine china and elaborate meals, served as the first stage of processing for victims who would end their lives not as guests, but as specimens. The yellow lamplight that once guided travellers to warmth and apparent safety has long since been extinguished. The forests have reclaimed the land where the mansion stood, nature covering the evidence of unnatural acts. But somewhere beneath the soil of Westfield, sealed chambers may still contain evidence of how far human curiosity can descend when divorced from moral constraint, and how easily monstrosity can hide behind a mask of respectable hospitality. If this story has given you chills, you understand why these dark chapters of American history must never be forgotten. Their lessons about vigilance and the dangers behind respectable facades remain relevant to this day. Hit that like button if you want us to continue bringing these buried historical horrors to light, and subscribe so you never miss our explorations of the darkest corners of America's past.